Hi again then guys, and welcome to another instalment of Beards and Cars. This is a podcast style series on the channel for those who maybe haven't clicked through to this series before, where we talk about stuff like the channel, YouTube, cars, gaming in general. And in this particular pick, I kind of wanted to focus in once again into the world of Gran Turismo Sport, like we did last week. And of course that video got a lot more views than this series usually gets because of the timing of it. I inadvertently recorded the video literally right before the new car pack announcement dropped. So a couple of the cars, or at least at the time I thought a couple of the cars, because it didn't turn out to be a light car company rocket of course, I believed were in the pack. As it happens, the Aventador was, so hey, that's not too bad. And there seemed to have been a little bit of confusion for some people as to how many of those cars I got correct. I didn't say that those 20 cars were coming out now. I was talking about the entire lifetime of Gran Turismo Sport. So, you know, who knows what else is going to be added. I was just picking out the 20 cars that I think, over the course of its life, are highly likely to come back. And when I was recording some footage yesterday for the coming week, potentially, of reviews on the channel, there was a car that I was driving, which I also think has a pretty strong chance of coming back, actually, because of how good it was, how popular it was, and also how good the graphics already are. It was a newer car, relatively speaking, in the game, the BMW 135i. I would not be at all surprised if they brought that car back, or possibly even the TII concept, but I think that one's a little bit less likely, to GT Sport. So you could kind of add that one to the list as well. I think that car has a pretty good chance, actually, of coming back. Although, personally, I would much rather see the 1M, which is a far nicer car, of course. Now, all that to one side, the purpose of this episode, as you can see, and as you can always see in the timestamps down in the video description, if you want to skip back and forth through the video, is that I wanted to specifically talk about a hot-button topic. I think it is one which we have discussed before, quite a while back in this same series, relatively soon after the game was released, I think. And that is the discussion about Group X. Group X classification, specifically in Gran Turismo Sport. Now, this is just that. It's a discussion. Just like the episode about self-driving cars, it's an opportunity to slap your opinion down in the comments, preferably to explain why you feel that way as well, because that's the whole point of a discussion. You can't sway someone's opinion just by telling them to change it. That just doesn't work. So, my personal opinions about Group X are actually mixed, and I'm sure this is the case for you guys as well. At first, I was dead on opposed to it, because before we started getting extra cars in the game, like drift cars, formula cars, etc., we initially had a relatively obvious selection of cars in the Group X. Stuff like the Chaparral 2X, the Tomahawk X, basically every car with X in the name. But those cars were obvious. Of course they should be in that kind of category, because they're just way too good to be racing against, say, LMP cars, or supercars, or certainly GT3 cars. But even back then, there were certain vehicles which were almost just lumped in there with the rest of them, which just shouldn't be. And the prime example, probably the most glaring example so far, even including the DLC cars, for me, it would have to be the BMW i3. That is a ridiculous vehicle to have in Group X. And there is literally no reason for that to be in Group X. It's a production car. It's not a concept. Yes, it's electric, but, I mean, who cares? It's a production car, so it should be in the normal N classes. And for those who might say, well, maybe it's because it's a little bit too good for those classes. Well, no, not really, because the top speed on it is actually pretty bad. So in effect, it's basically just a replacement for the Nissan Leaf, or the Toyota Prius, in the older games, except it's much more like the Leaf, in as much as it doesn't matter what you do to it, the top speed is never very good. So there is absolutely no reason why that BMW should be a Group X car. That is the most ridiculous vehicle, as far as I'm concerned, to have in there. Now, in the grand scheme of things, you don't hear everyone clamouring for the BMW i3 to be put into its correct category. It's a very nitpicky thing, but at the same time, sometimes nitpicks are appropriate, because in a game like Gran Turismo, there's a higher standard to hold yourself to, and there is for Forza as well. And of course, anti-Forza fans, if you want to call it that, will disagree, but for those like myself who play both franchises, and there are plenty of you guys on the channel as well who do, both franchises are held to a higher standard than, say, Test Drive Unlimited would be, or Project Gotham would be, or Need for Speed, or Midnight Club, because those games don't even try to be realistic for the most part. Test Drive Unlimited kind of does, Project Gotham kind of does, but even then, not really. The handling is nothing like real life. And then stuff like Midnight Club, Need for Speed, they're way off, of course. They've always embraced that. But with that in mind, the inherent problem with that is that by trying to make a game, and I guess this would also go for Assetto Corsa and Project Cars, although I don't play those personally. I own them, but I don't play them that much. The bar that the creators of the game set for themselves dictates that players of the game expect that bar to be reached. And that's not the player's fault. That's the maker of the game who decided to do it that way. And with Gran Turismo, that's always been the case. I mean, their slogan is literally the real driving simulator. Now, that's never been true, of course, but they've always tried to give off that aura, to have realistic-looking cars, realistic handling, relatively speaking, realistic specs. And even then, they still get it wrong, but most of the time, you just don't notice it. For instance, the classic premium Volkswagen Beetle on Gran Turismo 6 actually has a quoted weight, which is completely wrong. In the dealership, I think it's quoted at something like 1,100 kilos, the curb weight. When you actually buy the car, it's like 800. It's way off. And that's not something which they could have easily missed. Someone had to input that number. It's kind of like the FT1, the Toyota FT1 concept on GT Sport. I touched on, in the review for that car, how awful, truly awful the graphics are, and yet somebody didn't notice that, or decided not to do anything about it. And I tend to think that it was probably the former, because I don't think they would have just left that as it was deliberately. So why am I talking about all this? Well, to bring it back, because it does tie in, the problem with all of this is that they've set themselves a bar that we hold them to. So when something like a BMW being in the wrong category occurs, it does stand out. Because on Project Gotham, who would care? On Test Drive Unlimited, who would care? Some people would, but most wouldn't. Whereas Forza and Gran Turismo are kind of like these big movie franchises like Marvel and DC, which I am a fan of as well. And once again, I'm a fan of movies in both, which I know is an unpopular thing again. But those movies try to have such a high standard within the genre that people do pick them apart whenever possible. And part of that is to do with modern culture. People like to pick things apart. It's part of the same culture that dislikes videos for the sake of it and puts stupid comments. I embrace those things, because at the end of the day, those people are giving me free views, and what I like to do is when someone puts a dumbass comment, I like to reply to it and then block them, so that they can read it and not reply. So, who's getting trolled ultimately? But those kind of people are becoming more and more common, and that's part of internet culture now, and it's also part of millennial culture, unfortunately, especially from the year 2000 onward. But all of this adds into the problem of Group X, because it means that something which shouldn't be an issue at all, I mean, at the end of the day, who really cares about a car class? It shouldn't matter, and yet it does, because if enough people say something, it seems to matter more. Now, with that being the case, they've set themselves that Group X category, and then they haven't really done much with it. It's become, and many of you guys have said this as well, almost like a dumping ground. We ended up with cars in there that sometimes do make sense, because for instance, when I talked about the new Polyphony Formula car, that makes sense that that is in Group X. Of course it does. Now, we could say there should be a Group F for Formula cars, and I would totally agree with that, but for the moment, I can totally get why it's a Group X car. Of course, that does make sense, because it's just too fast. And that should be the true purpose of Group X, vehicles which are just too good to be anywhere else. The Tomahawks, the Chaparral 2X, the Formula car, potentially something like the Red Bull, if it was brought back. That should definitely be a Group X car. Again, it's in the name of the car, so it kind of gives you a hint. But then you have other ones in there which just don't make sense. Stuff like the Fittipaldi. Why on earth would you put the Fittipaldi in Group X? It's not like it can beat every Group 3 car in the game. It can beat some of them, but it's actually a surprisingly well-matched car. Just add balance of performance and you're ready to go. Then you've got something like the aforementioned BMW, which is the most ridiculous one of all. That should easily be N100, N200, and it would be a kind of useful car. But let's be honest, it's not that competitive anyway. Even if it were there, it would be able to beat, what, the Samba Bus, probably, and that's about it. But still, it gives you the option of using a legitimate car in a legitimate class. Then, much more recently, we've got in the same pack as the Formula car, the Isle of Man Time Attack Subaru. And I know from comments and messages from you guys, this is one of the ones that have annoyed you the most. And I think that that's good that that's happened, because it's easy to become complacent about an issue and then eventually talk about it so much that it doesn't mean anything anymore and people just get sick of hearing it, which is kind of the case with the BMW i3 because it's been part of the game since day one. So people tend to complain, and then when they see that nothing gets done, they stop complaining, which is the way, unfortunately, society is in general. People complain about Apple, but then they buy another one. That doesn't help the issue. People complain about YouTube, but then they continue making videos. And of course, I still do, but that's partially because I haven't been hit as badly as, say, my second channel, the horror channel. That that channel, even, has been completely neutered by YouTube adpocalypse fallout, if you want to look at it that way, because of the nature of the content. And yet, as I've said before, big YouTubers talk all day long, but do they actually move to do anything about it? No, they don't. Even if you watch people like PewDiePie, who is, let's be honest, the ultimate figurehead of YouTube, purely because he's the biggest person on there, he has the opportunity to have a voice. But you will often see in his videos that he will attack YouTube, but he'll do it in kind of a roundabout way so that they don't really harm him because of it, so that it doesn't harm his career opportunities or advertising opportunities. And on the one hand, you can understand that, because it is his living, of course, as it is for any large YouTuber channel. But at the same time, if you're going to accept the title of social influencer, which is what a YouTuber is, then do your job. Don't just take up the mantle and enjoy the fame. Actually do something with it to help the rest of us, which is what you're supposed to be doing. And it's not just PewDiePie who's guilty of that. There are plenty of people who have raised issues before. Stuff like plagiarism on YouTube or copyrighted videos. Matthias, for instance, raised the issue of a class action lawsuit about it against Google. Was anything ever done? No. It was just talk. And of course you can't make someone do it, but it's just a shame that more YouTubers aren't getting on board and actually using the true power that they have, because they do have power for change. Because at the end of the day, YouTube's got nothing if they refuse to work. Google likes to think that they have power, but they really don't. They are at the mercy of YouTubers. And unfortunately, most YouTubers just aren't forward-thinking enough to know that they have that power. They think that they're at the mercy of Google. That's not how it works. As soon as you stop making videos, you are severely cutting the revenue of those bosses at YouTube. And if enough YouTubers start to do that, they will notice a difference. And they'll start having to be forced to do something about it. But as long as you're still just making the normal schedule and just complaining on the side, well, why should YouTube do anything? You're just going to roll over and play dead. And that's unfortunately what YouTubers are doing. Now, for those of us with smaller channels, as I've said before, we can't. We just don't have the power, we don't have the funds to take them to court about it. It's just not possible. And there's no way that you could get a network of smaller channels to open some kind of class action lawsuit, because for the same reasons, they don't feel confident enough. They haven't got the funds to last that long against such a massive company. It's the big YouTubers who can, because there are something like 1,000 channels or more that have 1 million subscribers or more. So it's not difficult. That kind of base of power could easily take on the heads of YouTube and maybe even get them out of the job and get someone new in there who actually knows what they're doing. For instance, and again, this is all a side point, but it's kind of related tangentially, and as I said, the timestamps are in the video anyway, but Casey Neistat interviewed one of the bosses of YouTube, in effect, and he asked him something to the effect of, why do all of the people running YouTube have no experience whatsoever in producing videos? And then PewDiePie, in one of his recent videos, tried to almost defend the whatever manager of whatever department of YouTube that was being interviewed about, well, you don't need to be a producer to be a manager of something, you don't have to have that experience. Well, no, you don't. But it sure does help. And to say that it doesn't is ridiculous. That's like having someone become a manager who was a floor sweeper before. I mean, good for them, but that's not going to be good for the rest of the team because they don't have a clue what they're doing. And it's readily apparent that that is the case with the leadership at YouTube. They are more concerned with whatever it is they're concerned with. Who really knows? Because it's clearly not income, because they could be making far more if they actually helped YouTubers properly. And this isn't an issue which has come up now. This has constantly been an issue that they don't tell YouTubers when changes are happening. The very people who need to know are the last ones to know. It's always newspapers and rumours that happen first. But to get back on track, and I'll have to put a timestamp there in the video for those who wanted to skip that little rant, and it is a rant that unfortunately is an ongoing thing, we have Group X as a dumping ground. So if that is the case, just like with YouTubers, what would we actually want to be done differently instead of just complaining about it? Because that's the real issue. Well, ultimately, talking about it isn't going to do that much, again. But at the same time, it can. Because if you do talk about it enough, and if enough people talk about it enough, then polyphony can be swayed. They have, I believe, been in the past. Certain vehicles have been changed, updated, added. So who knows what talking about it can do. It can't do any wrong, that's for sure, because talking about problems is a good way of dealing with them. Even if it means that it's more of a cathartic thing, it's still a benefit. So, for me personally, the changes that I would like to see happen with the Group X issue, if you want to look at it as an issue, which I do, I would basically just like to see the vehicles in there slightly redistributed. I don't want to see an end to Group X because it serves a purpose, but the X should denote what it would usually denote: experimental. That's what it means with the Tomahawk, that's what it means with various other vehicles that have the X moniker added. It's an experimental car. Even one of my favourite race cars, the Howmet TX with the gas turbine engine in real life, it's called the TX, Turbine Experimental. So the X always denotes that. So if that's the definition, which most people accept, then again, why do you have these cars that shouldn't be in there? For instance, the Time Attack Subaru should not be in there. The BMW i3 should not be in there. There are so many Vision GT cars which shouldn't be in there. Not because they're not fast enough, but because they just shouldn't be. It's not that kind of car. They are concept cars, but they're not that kind of concept car. Because there's a big difference, even within the world of concept cars, between concept car, prototype, show car, experimental vehicle. There are multiple subgenres. So, like a concept car is something which you have to show the public for production. Somewhat like a Ford GT concept, or a Zonda concept. Something which you intend to produce, but you want to see what the public thinks of it. Then you have like a test prototype, which pretty much speaks for itself. That's beyond the concept stage, you're getting it ready for production. Then you've got a show car. Now a show car can be a wide variety of things. A show car could be a modified production car, it could be an aftermarket version, which is essentially what I just said, or you could have a show car that's more of a visual showcase, which again borders closely on concept, but it tends to be just a rolling shell, basically, with no engine or proposed drivetrain. Something like the Toyota FT1 concept, for instance, which doesn't have an engine. But then you have stuff which is more like experimental vehicles, and that is the kind of stuff which for the most part we have in the game, in Group X, stuff like the Tomahawks, the Red Bulls, the Chaparral 2X, and to some degree cars which are too fast. So what I would like to see change about that personally, and again I've heard others say this as well, not just on the channel but elsewhere, is why not just add a couple of new classes? Why not add a Group F for formula cars, a Group D for drift cars, let's say, you could even have a Group C for concept cars, but ones which aren't fast enough to justify Group X. And the difference would be, and this is the crucial difference, is that it would put an end to the feeling of Group X being a dumping ground. It would actually make it a legitimate category. Because, I know Gran Turismo players won't want to hear this, but on Forza, I know, the dark side, there is a Group X on many of the games. It used to be Group U, which stood for Ultimate, but then they changed it to X. And basically Group X on Forza is for vehicles with a PI of 999, the absolute pinnacle in the game. That is a perfect representation of what it should be, the ultimate performance car. And something like an LMP car, for instance, take the Mazda 787B as an example. The Mazda 787B would be classified in Forza 4, for instance, as something like, I don't know what it was, 970 PI, let's say. But then if you de-restrict the engine to full power, you bump it up into Group X, because it's that much faster. That's how it should work. And that brings us to another thing which I think should be able to change in the game. We have the N classes, where the power dictates which N class the car will be in. Well, what's to stop that from happening with something like a test prototype, or a conceptual test car, like the Chaparrals and the Red Bulls, the Tomahawks? Because with some of those vehicles, you could reduce the power and actually make them a lot slower. So why not have it so that they can actually come out of Group X if you make them slow enough? Now, of course, that wouldn't apply to most of them, but for something like a Formula car, if you reduce the power on that Formula car right down, speaking from experience in Gran Turismo 6, you can make that car a lot slower. And in fact, you can make it slow enough so that LMP cars can beat it. So what's to have that not happen now? Because clearly Group 1 is not just for Le Mans cars. We have Vision GTs in there as well, which are not prototypes. Stuff like the Group 1 Veyron, or it's not a Veyron, the Group 1 Chiron, technically. The Group 1 Tomahawk. They are not LMP cars. They are more GT1 style machines, if anything. So why not have it so that cars can actually change category between, say, Group 1 and Group X, dependent on how good they are, but also vice versa? What if the Group 1 Tomahawk or the Group 1 Bugatti could go up into Group X if you increase the power? That would make it a much more fluid system, which would also make the classes mean more. And of course, get stuff like the BMW way out, put it in N100, get the Time Attack Subaru out there. And again, the Time Attack Subaru, you could make an argument, is, say, too fast for the road classes, as many people would say the Group 3 road cars are, which is a fair point. But what if instead you had another category, like Group T, or something like that, for time attack cars? Because I wouldn't be surprised if we get more time attack cars added, because in the past of Gran Turismo we have had others, the Amuse Carbon R Skyline, the HKS Evo. They are time attack cars, and very, very good ones as well. So why not have a time attack category? At the moment we'd only have one car in it, but expand for the future. You could have Group D, Group C. You could have something like a Group V for vintage cars or classic cars. I don't particularly care what the classes are called as long as it's implemented, because again, you spend 20 million credits, or a combined 40 million credits, on cars which you can never use, apart from in a one-make race. That's ridiculous. It's such an insult to the lineage of the car to not be able to use it. Now, should it be up against Group 3 cars, Group 2 cars, if they ever add that, Group 1 cars? Well, no, of course not, because they're going to wipe the floor with them. But they do need their own category. We have classics in the road classes, which can go up against conventional cars, so why shouldn't that apply in the racing world? Why should they be relegated to this useless category? So ultimately, I don't expect a massive amount of change to happen anytime soon, if at all, but I think it is something which Polyphony definitely needs to at least think about, if not address. And of course they have a lot of things to think about. That's what you do when you run a business. But it's one of the most glaring issues with the game, and there are many people who don't care about Group X, but those also tend to be the people that don't care about anything because they think that's cool. Whereas if you care about the right thing and put your emotion and potentially anger and frustration behind that, that can be a good thing. Regardless of whether it's a game, because usually those kind of issues tend to be social ones in the real world. But there's nothing wrong with wanting something to be better in a game. Nothing at all. So, ultimately, will anything get changed? Well, that's pretty much impossible to say. I would be more inclined to expect probably not, rather than probably so. But it's an interesting discussion either way. So how do you feel about it? As I said at the start of the video, I'm sure there are people who have different opinions, but more than just different opinions, because it's not difficult to have a different opinion. Many people just do it for the sake of it. But to actually have a different opinion and explain why, that is what I'm interested in seeing. Just like with the self-driving cars, we had some great discussions down in the comments of that episode. I didn't expect the response to be that good, actually. I didn't think it was something that many people cared that much about, but you guys do. So also, as always, if there is something that you would specifically like to have a channel-wide discussion about, and it doesn't have to be cars even. It could be, as I said at the start, games, videos, movies even, whatever, YouTubers, social issues, whatever, then you can slap that down below and we can talk about that. But that's it for this pick overall, or this episode, really, and I'll see you guys next time. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.